Yep. Yep.
Okay, so let's get started here. Y'all, we have screamed through music history at a pace, at a rate. We've gone at warp 8.5 or warp 9 probably through the music history in terms of choral music. I wanted to bring that up because, you know, we have barely, you know, it's kind of like when you're on a flight and you know you're 35,000 feet up in the air, and like you know that you're over India, you know that you're over Indiana or Texas or whatever, but you don't. I mean, you don't know any more about Texas from flying over it than you did before, right? That is basically what we've done in this class with music history. You now know that there is a medieval and Renaissance period, and you know that there's a Baroque period and classical period. But what we've done is fly over them, and you know, occasionally in an in-flight announcement will tell you that, oh, this is Mozart and this is Dufay and whatever. So there's so much more to know, and that's another reason why in the months coming up, we're going to take special time to go back and look at certain genres in more detail. The point of this class was to give you an overview so that you, again, you did know that there were such a thing as Baroque period and classical period, so that you had a frame for your knowledge to grow onto. Think of it as a vine growing up on a trellis. You know, knowing these names helps form a trellis that your vine can grow up onto. But I'm excited that tonight we can scream through the Romantic period and look at some of this, and maybe after we're done, you can just be. My hope is that you're fascinated enough by what we've talked about to keep listening and keep reading and attend further courses and learn a little more, so that maybe, you know, when we get back to singing in person together, you know, we have just a little bit, even if it's just a little bit more, we have a little bit more context for what we're doing and why it's important and how it should sound and how it should go. Who did I not say hi to? Rhonda, you're here. Sandy. Pat, hello, Pat. Hello, Paul. Tom, Jean, Ron, Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth. I hope you're all happy and well. So here we go. Let's read through the Romantic period and we'll talk along the way. The Romantic period began with the second quarter of the 19th century. It should be noted, however, that throughout the history of music, there has been a tension between the classical and Romantic views of life and art. We've discussed this before. Classical perspective being about form and objective kind of shape, and Romantic being more emotional. Objectivity versus subjectivity, form versus freedom, and individuality versus universality are issues that composers and other artists have confronted in every age. Romantic tendencies were evident in the music of all three of the preeminent Viennese classical composers, particularly Mozart and Beethoven. And by the end of Beethoven's career, the Romantic spirit was firmly entrenched in Europe, remaining the dominant force in music until the beginning of the 20th century. There are some fundamental Romantic characteristics that should be noted to begin this discussion. Classicism and Romanticism represent two opposing views of life and art. Whereas classicism is objective, Romanticism is subjective. Control of harmonic tension, balance between dissonance and consonance, and the careful and complete exploitation of thematic development give classical music a definite and distinct formal structure. Conversely, the Romantic spirit requires the loosening of formal constraints and the uninhibited expression of the individual composer's ideas and emotions. One way in which the Romantic spirit was expressed in the 19th century was through nationalism. Whereas classical music tended to be universal in character, during the 19th century, certain composers and compositions paid tribute to their country of origin through the use of folk melodies, dances, or instruments, or through the musical depiction of some locale in the homeland. Just as nationalism reflected a preoccupation with the composer's own national heritage, exoticism was a Romantic fascination with music from other lands. An often cited example of this tendency was Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, depicting scenes from the Arabian Nights. In fact, anything mysterious or exotic appealed to the Romantic mind. The writing of Poe exemplifies this preoccupation with the mysterious or the morbid. Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique tells of a young man's opium-induced visions of his beloved. Berlioz wrote a commentary or a program describing the extra musical scenes depicted by each of the work's 5 movements. Right here, I want to draw a distinction between the idea of a program in terms of what it is. It's not just the book you get at the beginning of the concert, right? However, one of the reasons why you today get a book at the beginning of the concert was because a lot of this music back in the 19th century, the composer needed you to know the story before you listened to the music. So they would have the story written down in this little pamphlet, and they'd give each audience member a pamphlet when they walked into the concert so they could read the story and follow along with the story while they listened to the piece of music. That is what a program is. So when you hear the term programmatic music, you mean that it's music tied to some external story or some external goings on or some mood, some explanation that you can't just get from a pure listening of the music. And then absolute music is music that does not have those programmatic elements. So for instance, a piece of programmatic music might be called Night on Bald Mountain. You ever heard that piece? Night on Bald Mountain. It's in Fantasia, the original Fantasia. That's a programmatic music. It's automatically in the title. The composer has you thinking about the name of that piece and what it relates to in the music. However, if you listen to the String Quartet No. 8 by Shostakovich, you're not thinking about anything except the string quartet. That music is very absolute music. The idea of program music intended by the composer to depict specific non-musical ideas was another important aspect of 19th century Romantic style. Although the forms of the classical period continued to be used by Romantic composers, they took many more liberties with them, expanding and contracting them to suit their individual taste. During the Romantic period, both miniature and heroic forms become popular. The Lieder, which remember is just a German word for song, of Schubert exemplify the Romantic spirit in a small and intimate form, just as Mahler's Symphony of 1000 does so by involving 2 4-part choirs, a voice choir, 7 soloists, and a large orchestra in an undertaking so massive that it limits the opportunities to hear it perform. It literally sometimes takes 500 or 600 people to do that work. So if you don't have 500 or 600 people, you're kind of out of luck. During the Romantic period, the resources of tonality were completely exhausted, and chromaticism too was fully exploited. The highly chromatic works of Wagner and other late 19th century composers represented the final stage of this process, which led to a variety of alternative harmonic organizational structures that signaled the end of the Romantic era around the beginning of the 20th century. Romantic composers were anxious to exploit to the fullest the potential of the orchestra in terms of tone color, as well as pitch and dynamic range, making unprecedented demands on players. The orchestra increased in size during the 19th century to the point where it sometimes numbered in the hundreds. By the late 19th century, dynamic markings such as pianissimo or fortissimo were common, and extensive use of crescendo and decrescendo added to the expressive resources available to composers. Another thing we see during this era is a lot of composers using their vernacular language when they're writing in their scores. Mahler did not use many Italian terms when he wrote in his scores. So if you're going to look at a score by Mahler, you have to be familiar with German terms for musical things. Percy Grainger, who was he was an Australian, but he was a British composer of the time. He was very much a nationalist, and he hated using Italian terms. So you will never see Italian terms in his scores. It's always, in these funny kind of idiomatic English terms. Again, another demonstration of that nationalism that these guys were feeling. Much of the writing for chorus from this period also seeks to fully exploit the possibilities of the human voice. Beethoven's Missa Solemnis makes great demands on the singers, and the performance of choral orchestral masterworks composed later in the century also requires singers with solid vocal technique for a successful performance. This fascination with tone color and the use of augmented instrumental forces helps explain the dominance of instrumental music in this era. Without exception, the musical giants of the era were primarily composers of instrumental works, in particular symphonies. The great composers of the era were great symphonists. Most of the great choral masterworks of the period were choral and orchestral works. I don't know why it indicates to me to stop and talk about this. Something just tells me to talk about this here. you hear me say, I've caught myself saying it several times in the course of this study, which as I say, these guys. It's important to note that there are women composing at every stage of musical history, but the problem is that the works composed by women are not very well documented. So we don't have this deep literature about Clara Schumann's music or other women who were composing at the time's music. We don't have the access to copious numbers of scores and publications of this music. And so frequently, if you walk up to a shelf of music, it won't be present, even in a library, even in an archive, because at the time, their music was under and devalued. Clara Schumann's husband, Robert Schumann, the Schumann you all might be more familiar with, discouraged her from writing music, even though this lady played the piano like a monster and wrote wonderful piano concertos and wonderful songs that Hannah's in fact done a whole recital of Clara Schumann's art song. There's tons of music out there to be found, and in fact, we're currently in a state where everyone is digging and trying to rediscover this music that was written. And one thing I want to discourage you from doing is, one thing I've heard a lot lately is, Clara Schumann was the female Brahms. No, she was not the female Brahms. Her name was Clara Schumann, and she was a genius in her own right. So when we describe people as this derivative of this other thing, we're privileging things that are not fair. There was a composer in the classical period who wrote music just as good as Mozart, but everyone calls him the Black Mozart, which is horrendous. We should know his name, you know what I mean? And I don't even know his name. That's how shameful this is. I can't remember his name, but we all should know his name. So as you study music history, I encourage you to try not to assume that only the great composers were only men, and not to assume that just because you don't find a lot of publications of certain things, or it's not readily available, that it is somehow of lesser quality. That is one thing that scholarship in music is having to grapple with now, because musicologists and music historians have done an awful job of categorizing and archiving things for so long that we're in a bad position about that. Anyway, let's continue. 300 years earlier, during the Renaissance, choral music had been predominant, with instrumental parts added occasionally that reinforced or doubled the choral lines. Through the ensuing centuries, the balance and importance between choral and instrumental music as the setting for stylistic change shifted steadily from choral to instrumental forms. In performing music of the Romantic period, the tempo should be elastic, reflecting the expressive nuances of the text. The idea of rubato, which we mentioned earlier, wherein the tempo varies, is an important aspect of Romantic style. The word rubato is an Italian word that means stolen. And the entire premise of stolen time is that you have to return it. So if you take a certain amount of time, you have to sort of speed up into the next phrase to give the time back. And that's what gives music of Chopin and Fauré and certain things like that. It's beautiful, elegant sing quality that we love so much about it. To perform many of the great choral orchestral masterworks effectively requires mature voices capable of producing a wide range of pitch, dynamics, and expression. Our choruses, not just our choruses around here, but any amateur choir, there's always a bit of a stratification in the quality of voices in the choir, right? You have a couple people in each section who have really powerful voices that sort of carry it along. And then you have a lot of people right in the middle that are good voices, but maybe they're not big voices, or maybe they're not of the quality that reminds you of opera or reminds you of professional singers. And then you have other people that are just trying and they're learning, right? The choirs that perform the kind of music that we're going to talk about tonight are full of opera singers. So if you hear professional recordings of the Verdi Requiem, for instance, you're going to hear a choir that is full of voices that would just honk. So imagine a section of tenors, of 25 or 30 tenors that all sound as loud as I do. That's the kind of tenor section you need to really do the Verdi Requiem. And if you don't have that, it can be compromising to the voices singing the music, because even though you don't have that kind of voice, you're going to feel obligated to make that sound, right, Paul? Because you know that Verdi demanded that kind of sound, and so you want to give Verdi what he wanted, and you know, that can hurt your singers' voices, or it could just make it not very effective, and people say, well, that was a cute Verdi Requiem, but let's go listen to our recording of Robert Shaw when we get home. You know, that's not what you want people thinking either. So this is a conversation I have frequently when people say, Joshua, oh, that was a lovely concert you did of Celtic music. For the spring, can we do the Verdi Requiem? And I'm like, probably not. I don't see it or hear it in my head, but, you know, we can think about it. Yeah. The Romantic era was a period in which individual expression was of critical importance in the interpretation of music. Romantic composers used standard notation and indicated in relatively specific terms the way they wished for their music to be performed. In performing the choral music of the period, study the text and the markings of the composer in the score. These indications provide the basis for an effective performance. Let me qualify this statement here. Yes, what the composer said is awfully important, but the composer is dead in most cases, and they don't care what we do, okay? So more important than their indications are our ability to effectively communicate what is all we also interpret in the text too. So what I didn't mean to write in this section was anything that made you feel like you were obligated to do what some dead person wrote in their score. You're not. What I did want to say, what I meant to say was that they wrote so much more in their scores for us to read and know what they really wanted, that there's more to discover. So spend more time looking at that. But none of us are slaves to what Verdi or whatever said. They've been dead a long time. Let them go. Significant composers and works. Gioacchino Rossini, though noted primarily for his operas, wrote several choral works in his later years. He wrote a Messa Solenile. If you listen to the Beethoven Missa Solemnis, this work will not make you think of that. It's a cute little thing, written for piano and a harmonium, frequently done with two pianos. He wrote an orchestration later, but it's not the best. It's meant for church. Beethoven's Solemn Mass is not necessarily meant for church. It was more of a concert work, but Rossini was definitely writing for church. It's a very nice little thing. And frequently people don't think about it when they think about romantic choral music, so I didn't include a recording, but it's one to know. He also wrote a Stabat Mater, which is not a painful, agonized Stabat Mater that you might hear from other composers. The Stabat Mater means stands the mother. And the Stabat Mater text is poems written about Mary watching Jesus be crucified. So the work can be horrifically painful, which would be appropriate for that time, that liturgical time of year. But his setting is more comforting, which is very interesting. And more Catholic, I might say. Franz Schubert wrote 6 masses and several shorter choral works on both sacred and secular texts. Schubert's last 2 masses are considered his most important choral pieces, although it should be noted that his Mass in C and the shorter works provide excellent performance possibilities for school choral ensembles. The Schubert Mass in G, which I linked to, is by far the most famous Mass that he wrote. It can be sung by high school singers, it can be sung by community choirs very easily, very effectively performed with just a string quartet or with organ or with, there's also orchestration that he wrote. Very nice little piece. Great choral builder. Lets choirs really get to know each other's voices, not hard to sing. Mendelssohn wrote 3 oratorios, St. Paul, Elijah, and Christus, which he left unfinished. In addition, he wrote some choral lieder, so choral songs, motets, and psalm settings. His fame as a choral composer is based primarily on his oratorios, of which Elijah is the most frequently performed. Mendelssohn's Lobgesang, their hymn of praise, is a choral orchestral piece including chorus, tenor, 2 soprano soloists in the last and longest movement. It's a bit of a choral symphony, in fact. Now, Mendelssohn, you might be asking, hold on a second, it's been a long time since we heard of the word oratorio. Well, Mendelssohn found in a desk drawer at this church he was working at a whole bunch of scores by Bach. And so, the scores by Bach that he found in particular were the Mass in B minor and several of the Passions, the St. John Passion, St. Matthew Passion, and the Magnificat by Bach. And there was this revival of the music of Bach. Mendelssohn actually wrote a whole symphony called the Reformation Symphony. And the theme that he uses to structure the entire symphony is a mighty fortress. And one of the reasons why he did that is because he had just discovered Bach, rediscovered Bach. So you see this little renaissance of Bach happening in the Romantic period, which they, of course, would like the music by Bach because Bach was a romantic in the Baroque period, right? So the very emotional, spirited quality of Bach's music was something that they would have loved. And so there's these great revivals of not only Bach, but also Handel. So there's this reorchestration of Messiah that Mendelssohn wrote. He rewrote the orchestra parts for a big old fat romantic orchestra. It's very inspiring to hear. Orchestra with harps and trombones, trumpets and horns and percussion and everything. It's really, really interesting. So Mendelssohn was sort of on the forefront of that renaissance. It's very, very nice music, very, very nice stuff. Berlioz, I don't mention very much because he's not performed very often, but you have got to hear the Berlioz Te Deum and the Requiem. The Berlioz Requiem, let me paint this picture for you, okay? Berlioz, he's in this big old cathedral, and he sets the setting of the part of the Requiem, Tuba Mirum. So basically, the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised. So Mozart in his Requiem, when he set the bit about the trumpet shall sound, there's a trombone solo, and the trombone kind of is the trumpet shall sound, right? Very cute, okay? Verdi put a couple trumpets up in the gallery. That's a little more dramatic. This is what Berlioz did. So you have the orchestra and this huge chorus. The chorus in the original performance of the Requiem was like 800 people in this huge cathedral, which if you haven't been in one of these cathedrals, you can't imagine how big they are. Then up in the gallery in front of them, an entire brass band. In this part of the nave, on this side of the cross of the church, another brass band. On this side of the church, another brass band. At the back of the church in the gallery, another brass band. And 25 timpanis, making the sound of the trumpet shall sound and the dead raising and the doom of the Dies Irae. It is something to hear, y'all. If you have not heard that before, the Tuba Mirum, Berlioz Requiem, I will send it in an email after this because I listened to it just today and I was like, holy crap. It just encapsulates the grandiose nature of Romanticism perfectly. You've got to listen to you some Berlioz if you haven't before. Robert Schumann, who's the husband of Clara Schumann, whom I talked about earlier, wrote an oratorio called Paradise and the Peri, which is still occasionally performed. I've never actually heard a performance of it, even though it is a wonderful work. And several sets of part songs, many of which are performable by a well-established high school choir. An excellent example is Zigeunerleben, or Gypsy Life. It's frequently actually performed by quartets, SATB quartets of opera singers. You know, if you do a recital together, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, you can, at the end of the concert, you can do some of these part songs. Very good music. Whoa, Johannes, sorry. Lord have mercy. Y'all fix that typo in your handouts there. In addition to the German Requiem, the Deutsche Requiem, wrote choral settings of folk songs, other choral lieder, and several choral orchestral works, including a cantata. The Brahms setting of folk songs are feasible repertoire for high school or even a well-established junior high choir, or any choir interested in some delightful pieces. The big thing, though, is the Deutsche Requiem. This Requiem is what I would describe as the first Requiem that was not about the judgment of the dead or the prayer for their souls after they die, but reflective of Johannes Brahms' Lutheranism in that he is setting texts that are not from the Roman Catholic Requiem Mass, but are texts decidedly chosen in order to communicate consolation to the living. So it's the first Requiem for the living. And it's a wonderful piece of music. And if you have time to sit through it all at once, it's worth it. If you don't, the first movement is the thing that kind of captured my imagination about Brahms. So if you could just listen to the first movement, you may end up listening to the rest of it because it's wonderful. Anton Bruckner, one of my favorites. Someone say something?
Yeah, Joshua, just there's one thing in there which I think many of us have sung the English version of "How Lovely Is Thy Resting Place,"
Right.
which part of that, and I'd forgotten that was in there, but it's pretty. That's awfully beautiful.
Yeah, that's one of the movements from the Mass. It's frequently excerpted. You're right, and so that can be sung by church choirs and stuff. That's not too bad. Other parts of the Requiem though are really tough, but it's a beautiful thing. Johannes Brahms. In the Romantic period too, since I mentioned that Brahms was a Lutheran, Anton Bruckner is the antithesis of that, in that he was absolutely not a Lutheran. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and which I even wrote there. This is critical to the understanding of Bruckner. You have to know a lot about the real core beliefs of Roman Catholicism versus Lutheran Protestantism to really understand the connection. But if that's something that interests you, there's a ton of things to learn about that, and a lot of parallels you can draw between the composer's music and their approach to the text, in addition to their own little pathos they put in all of their music. But Bruckner, some of his shorter works are approachable by high school choir. Example is the Locus Iste, but others are too demanding for young singers. It's true. All are notably beautiful in their depth of emotion, harmonic ingenuity, and dynamic contrast. He wrote 3 masses, a Te Deum, a setting of Psalm 150, which this sounds like it's small. This is a choral orchestral work. It's massive and it's long, and several shorter and secular choral works. This Mass in E minor is notable for its qualities of certainly being appropriate for use in a church service. So he definitely meant it for use in a church service. And you can see that in the orchestration for the Mass in E minor is actually not orchestra. It's a small wind ensemble and organ. So a group of people, a choir and an ensemble and an organ that would have fit in their choir loft. You see that happening a lot in Bruckner's music because he was working in a church and doing this kind of thing. These are diametrically opposed people here in terms of music, in terms of their faith. And you would think, I don't know, I won't read a little more about Brahms and Bruckner and tell me what you think. It's very interesting. I won't poison your opinion with my my take on it yet. So that is our blazing saddle journey through the Romantic period. There is a ton of music left to talk about. In fact, I didn't even get to a set of compositions and composers that we call the late Romantic, which is Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler, and people getting up into the 20th century. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, in the first 40 years of the 20th century, there's as much music written during those 40 years as was written during the Romantic and the Classical periods combined. So there's a ton of music to know about. One thing I would note about the Romantic period is that since the music is so much oriented towards the individual expression of the composers in their music, you see a lot more of their personal faith, their personal confessional attitudes, their personal experiences coming out in these works. And it's in the Romantic era that we sort of derive this idea towards literature, that literature is autobiographical in some way. Don't we all make that assumption about a lot of things these days? It's like, if I write a poem and it's sad and I post it on my Facebook, you're like, oh, Josh was really sad and he wrote this poem. That was not always true, especially in the Classical period. There was people that were writing things and painting things and dancing things for the pure edification of those classical ideas, not necessarily in terms of autobiographical, for a place of being autobiographical. In this period, though, the Romantic period, you do see that. In fact, all of Mahler's symphonies, for instance, were written in the summer times in between his long seasons conducting at the Vienna State Opera. And they're all very closely tied to what was happening in his life at the time. And he would even scribble in his score little references to things that were happening in his life. So we know that certain parts of the symphony are about certain things happening in his life. Mozart would have puked if you had suggested that he do that. That is not why he was writing music at all. And the kind of idea that Mozart and Salieri, for instance, had this feud, and Mozart's Requiem was written for his father because his pain over his father's death and everything. That's a very romantic idea. That was sort of imposed upon the real story, which is that Mozart was writing a Requiem because it was work, it was money, and he was doing a good job because he was a genius. It wasn't this like act of God that he wrote this Requiem as, you know what I mean? But that kind of idea, the supernatural, the nature, the emotionalism, that is all a very romantic thing, and is brought to a head in the Romantic period for sure. Any thoughts about this?
In terms of nationalism, when you were reading it, I immediately thought of the 1812 overture from Tchaikovsky.
Hugely nationalistic, featuring the Russian national anthem of the time and other folk music, not just Russian music either, but also French music, and sort of depicting that war, for sure. The American national anthem was in fact written in the 19th century, not so much during the time of independence, but later on when these feelings of nationalism were budding.
Where does Dvorak fit?
Dvorak is a romantic, and he is a great example of this idea of exoticism in music. So Dvorak was from the Czech. He was Czech, and he came to America to teach at Juilliard for 4 years, I think. And while he was here, he surveyed American folk music, including African American spirituals. And it was in his inspiration of that he wrote the Symphony from the New World, which features some of those Negro spiritual melodies, and also some folk music of indigenous peoples here. And he certainly cast that in a Western European guise when he wrote his symphony. But yeah, that's what Dvorak was doing.
What about Smetana's Moldau?
Smetana's Moldau is also an excellent example of program music, in that he's depicting this running river, and there's all these colors and the story about going down the river that he wrote. Yeah, that's actually the classic example of program music.
I had that at my wedding.
Oh, you did?
Yep.
Beautiful.
We planned it very quickly, and both of us loved that, so we just played it.
Elizabeth, I think I saw your hand up. You're muted though, unmute yourself.
You don't want to just read my lips. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
So the programmatic music, some of it is very nice, but I've never been able to attach the music to the silly stories that they write. I mean, sometimes if there's a river or a storm, that's kind of obvious, but I never saw how they enhanced anything with these stories, or how they even, I don't know, how even their music arose out of these stories. I don't see them. I don't understand it really.
Well, I don't think you're alone. And I think one thing to consider that I haven't talked about yet is that these romantics in the Romantic period in the 19th century, they had this attitude that they were the culmination of history up to that point. So, Goethe's poetry was the arrival of human civilization at the pinnacle of the mountain of literature and of music. And so I think you're right in that, a lot of this music is certainly programmatic, and then it's related to those stories. But I think the message more often was, look at the genius of my composition and how innovative my orchestration is, and I wrote it based on this impression. And I think the goal a lot of the time was to make their music more colorful than the program. So I think you're hitting on exactly that. I think that's what they meant to do, because they all thought that they were the end all. They thought that anything after them was going to be, you know, the decadence of civilization, which is another reason why it all kind of came crashing down at the beginning of the 20th century, because that attitude ended up being incorrect. And so a lot of people had to deal with the grim reality.
That every generation thinks they're the culmination and everything after them is going to suck. I mean, that's human nature.
Yeah, and the Romantics believed it harder than I think most people. They really did believe it. And Rhonda, what would you say?
Wagner.
Oh yeah, the issue of Wagner.
Yes.
Wagner wrote a lot of operas, not a lot of choral music. In fact, I don't think he wrote any. He wrote one piece early in his life called Der Liebesmahl der Apostel, which is it's basically the Last Supper. And it's for a cappella men's chorus and orchestra. And it's like, it's okay. He wrote it like when he was 17 or something. So it's not, and Wagner was not the great genius that he would have you believe he was. It took him a long time to write these wonderful works of genius. He wasn't scribbling these things down all the time. It took him a long time to work them out. But when he was younger, it wasn't that good. And he wrote a lot of operas. Wagner, I wouldn't say that any of his music exemplifies the idea of exoticism. I would say that a core feature of Wagner's music is this idea of bacchanalian approach to everything. So if you consider Mozart to be an Apollonian guy, so the idea of Apollo is that all art is to edify us and to lift our eyes to the gods and to these ideals that are lofty and difficult, and we'll look up to these examples and be better, in terms of morality and everything. Wagner was the opposite, in that in one of his operas, he, in order to demonstrate in his libretto that the power of love, that of undying love is he has a brother and sister fall in love with each other, and their love, even though it's sinful, their love produces a child that defeats the old gods, right? So it's this idea that, yes, this is horrible that a brother and sister fall in love with each other, but their love produced this child that did not know fear, and this child that did not know fear defeated these ancient tyrannical gods, and so we are independent and there is no God, right? That's a very simplistic approach to this entire philosophical problem that is Wagner. But, it is a total difference to what we were seeing in the classical period. I happen to love the music of Wagner and his operas, and I sing a lot of that stuff. But the Wagner, the man, is problematic any way you look at him. And so are the rest of them. But their musical genius, the musical legacy that they left us, can be powerful and strong and meaningful, separated from that. Wagner, huge. I could teach this course for an entire year on the problem that is Wagner and his music and his philosophy, and that poor man. And did you know that Wagner was short? When everyone thinks about Wagner being super tall, I think Wagner was like 5'1". How tall are you, Paul?
5'4".
You were taller than Richard Wagner. Does that surprise you? I would always imagine that he'd be this big old dude. I mean, my grandfather was this horrific racist Klan member, and he was like 6'8". And, when I think of evil people like that, I think of my grandfather towering over me, you know what I mean? Just wicked people. Wagner was this little dude. He was this little whiny guy that just was complaining all the time and offending people and running away and writing his little operas and, going into debt. I mean, he was this terrible, I would not want to know Wagner in person. I don't think any of us would have gotten along with Wagner.
Oh, Hitler loved
Anyway.
it. Right?
Enough hate on Wagner. Wagner wrote wonderful music, worth knowing and seeing. And even though certain expressions of his philosophy were meant to be offensive. They are very good examples of what this kind of romantic thought was leading to, and the reason why it declined. I mean, after Wagner, the guys that were influenced by him, a lot of these romantic ideals disintegrated and became what we saw happening at the end of the late Romantic in the 20th century. A lot of the reason why we got away from tonality and we had all of these experimentations in music was because it could not be sustained. That level of chromaticism and level of musical intensity couldn't be sustained. And the nationalism of the late 19th century, we can see sociologically coming to a big, crisis at the beginning of the 20th century and the two world wars, particularly the second one, the level of nationalism seen before, during, and after the Second World War, is obviously strongly influencing the music being created during that time, particularly after the Second World War, after the establishment of the communist bloc. The composers writing music in the world of communism is an entire lifelong study in and of itself too. Every time I talk about this, I just become overwhelmed with the fact that there are billions and billions of people alive right now. There have been billions and billions of people alive in the past. You can't possibly know all of their art, and to just fly over it has to be enough sometimes. But there's a lot of fascinating humanity to be found in any one of these eras, and so much of the human problem, particularly of the 20th century, since most of us are more familiar with all that. I mean, going and investigating how some of the sociological and anthropological conditions affected the creation of this art, and not just music, but also visual art and the other performing arts. The idea is some people can't understand minimalism in music. So the idea that something just repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats with very little change over amount of time. Some of those people hate Philip Glass, but they can stand in front of a painting by Rothko for a whole hour, and they can appreciate the blocks of color that is a Rothko painting and see the small variations in there and enjoy it. But they can't enjoy Philip Glass. And sometimes I think the interrelated study of these other disciplines can inform how we're supposed to appreciate music. The Rothko is a perfect example. If anyone does not know that name, go Google image search Rothko as soon as we get off this call and look at that and realize that those paintings are massive. Or if you imagine that the idea of music breaking down in the beginning of the 20th century, imagine that what is happening musically is happening also in the visual arts in the work of Picasso. And do you realize how long Picasso lived? He only died in like the 80s, right? When did Picasso die? Any art historians with us tonight?
Historian, but not all.
Yeah, he lived a long, not just he lived a long time, but he lived later than I think we think. The Cubist movement was mid 20th century, y'all. And he's composing these huge murals, definitely affected by World War II and a lot of the happenings in our history during that time. So if you ever find that you don't understand something in music, the first stop is art. If you don't understand something happening at any particular time in music, stop listening and go look up the visual art of the era and see if that helps you, helps inform you of how you're supposed to be taking in these works of art, because I think it certainly helps me.
Picasso died in 1973.
1973, yeah. A lot of people think of him as very early 20th century. He certainly wasn't, mid-century. Yes, Tom?
April 8th.
I had a comment about probably where people come from. I think is very interesting. I just have recently understood that Bernstein came from Russia. At an early age, he came to the United States and did all this stuff in the United States, not in Russia. But so we don't really think of him as a Russian. I don't. It's a Jewish Russian name, and it could be anything. And not only that, I'd like for you to talk maybe something about the influence of politics on what people composed. And with Tchaikovsky and the 1812 Overture, the fact that it had the various music from various countries all intermixed, I think was very interesting. Like, rather than having the people fighting with one another, you had the two choruses or were fighting with one another in the music. And I think it's an interesting thing. That's been done by other people. And then finally, I'm thinking about Handel. And Handel didn't like, I don't know for sure what Handel's story was about how Handel got from Germany to England, but he so much didn't want to be German that he changed his name. He had the pronunciation of the name with an umlaut on the A to make it short, and so he wasn't Handel, he was Handel, and then he became Handel, was spelled without the umlaut, and he became totally English, and he left his German background. And so stories like that from the others, please. You know about all of them, and you know good stories about Wagner, I'm sure.
Yeah, Wagner. Too many stories about Wagner. First thing you mentioned was Leonard Bernstein being Russian. What? Hold on a second.
Well, I saw a video that seemed to be pretty authentic.
I think he's right.
It showed a bunch of Russians dancing. I think they were in St. Petersburg, and they said that's where he was from. Right? I think maybe St. Petersburg, or it may have been Moscow.
He was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1918.
But his parents were expats of somewhere.
His parents were.
Yeah, so that's that connection. Yeah, you're right, but you're right though. One fascinating thing that I love, and if I ever wrote a book, it would probably be about this. Was there's this series of, on one level, Jewish people who were throughout musical history. They were sort of the. Have you ever heard the expression that Jews are without a home? There's I forget the Yiddish phrase, but it's like I'm a stranger in a foreign land. And so, for instance, Gustav Mahler. This is later. There's other beforehand, but Gustav Mahler found himself as a Jew in Vienna, which is the worst place to be as a Jew during that time. He found himself the conductor of the opera. To make life better for himself, he converted to Catholicism. And his wife was being unfaithful to him. So it's like this three level of things that he was a stranger in a foreign land. He was a Jew. He was, as a Catholic, he was a husband to a broken home. And so there's all of these stories of these Jewish artists that have this experience of being a stranger in a foreign land, and the product artistically of what they go through when that happens. But you see this where they're able to rationalize this reality of their experience in their artistic output. Tchaikovsky, when he wrote the 1812 Overture, was very much expressing this idea of the end of the war, right? This victory thing. So that's why I think he interrelated all that thematic material rather than there being this opposing thing, because the opposition, the war was over. On top of that, you have not only Jewish people exemplifying this idea of being a stranger in a foreign land, but you have Jewish gay men writing so much music during the 20th century and doing all this work along the time that just adds another element of that reality upon their art and their creative output. And that's a fascinating subject. And there's a whole book of letters written by Bernstein where they published I don't know why people kept letters the way they did back in the day, but they published all of the letters the man wrote, and seeing it, there's documentation that this was a big part of their experience and a big part of their thought processes as they were making their art. And that was the first thing you said, Tom. What was the second thing you said? Handel. Handel, one thing that brought him to England was the fact that he was primarily a writer of Italian opera, and there was this ban on opera during that time, so there was nothing keeping him in Italy. He actually was a German, but he was in Italy for a long time, and then he went to the UK and fell in love with English aesthetics, and that's why he sort of expatriated there. And you're right, he did change his name and trying to anglicize himself. And that produced a lot of these English oratorios that we sing now. That's happening all the time. And during the Baroque period, that was a little more accepted, that you had these people that were moving around a little bit and taking on new nationality, because we didn't have the strong nationalism that we see in the 19th century. In the 19th century, that never happened. And in fact, the fact that Stravinsky, as a Russian, moved from Russia to Paris was wild. Even though Paris at the time of his doing that was like the New York of Europe, in that it was this melting pot of art and culture, especially after the fall of the Tsar, when you saw a lot of Russian people fleeing Russia and settling elsewhere in Europe. It was happening more and more, but that was not very accepted. German composers were striving to be more German, and Italians to be more Italian, and French composers to be more French. And that's one of the reasons why we have such distinct national music of that period. And it's easy when you hear music of that period to say, oh, that's French, or oh, that's German, or oh, that's Italian, because they meant it so. Or British music, for that example. Frequently when we talk about nationalism, we don't think about the UK or the United States, but certainly there was that level of nationalism happening in the United States and the UK. In fact, after World War II, in the late 40s, you see the real explosion of American nationalism, where there's this true idolatry of the American ideal, leading to a strong development of this sort of political roots in music. You see in the mid-century very strongly a break between what is considered to be conservative musical ideas and liberal musical ideas. In the 50s, you see the idea of country and rock and roll. There's a lot of funny songs written about that dichotomy, right? Later, you have the rock and roll people, and you have the hippies. Later on, you have this breaking into many subgenres, and it's all this idea of conservative and liberal art. That is very new. That really was not a thing before, except in that, like the 19th century and the Romantic period, you have a lot of descriptions of art that are written in terms of good and bad. So in the 20th century, you see the adoption of that language by certain critics who define conservative and liberal as good and bad on both sides. So when you read literature from the mid-century, you can't necessarily trust what they're saying when they're making value calls on good and bad, because they may just mean different from their own personal opinions of aesthetic conservatism or liberalism. And the idea of conservative and liberal is even more current than the 20th century. That's really a 21st century idea. In case you haven't noticed, we're 20 years into the 21st century. It's been long enough to look back on the 20th century and kind of make some judgments, okay? They weren't even thinking in those terms. In the late 80s, early 90s, the issue with Tipper Gore and Congress about labeling CDs and labeling music as offensive. I mean, that is a huge cultural shift for music when all of that was happening. And you see, I don't know if you've ever watched those hearings, but I've watched all of those hearings. And I think it was like 12 or 16 hours of interviews and things in those hearings in order as a study of culture of that time. You have a strong imagined hierarchy or dichotomy between people that would seem to be liberal and conservative. I'm using these terms loosely in music, but you had these guys that were dressed up in these glam rock outfits because that's what they look like, because they're on tour and they stopped by Washington D.C. to testify in front of Congress, And they're saying, yo, I'm a Christian and I'm happy. And, you know, I write this music because it's an artistic expression of something that is not about, you know, they were criticizing the idea that you minimize the meaning of the music down to this basic idea that like rock music causes people to be violent. Well, that's not fair, because Wagner wrote an opera 150 years prior to that about a brother and sister falling in love and them killing the entire world at the end, burning. Okay, so clearly this predates the idea of rock and roll, and it really has more to do with literacy than with the dichotomy of conservative and liberal. Now, that's one thing that I take on board personally as I talk to everyone around me, which is, you know, everyone is happy to break things into categories, when really it comes down to, are we literate enough to appreciate the core meaning of a work of art if at first glance it seems to be something that we're not interested in? So that's a cultural thing that I think is it's just our time. You know, it's folks not stretching themselves to understand something that's not put in the terms they already understand. And if you look around in music, just talking about music in the current day, that's a product of our time. And that, you know, if you go on Spotify or you go on Apple Music or YouTube, you're going to find these niche genres, you know, where, and if it's outside of that genre, then you don't like that, you know. And that's something that people my age do all the time, and it just drives me completely crazy, because I'm like, well, what about people who straddle two genres? You know, who is the Beethoven of today that was classical and developed into romantic by the end of his life? You know, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for nuance, you know. And the study in a course like this in music history helps us to identify nuanced qualities of music by living people who had a true and valid experience of life and created this thing that is very, very nuanced and expressive of themselves or of their time. Because if we're not aware of those things, then it all just becomes white noise. You know what I mean? Music history becomes this thing that's in a book, and yeah, we kind of know that Mozart was in, you know, the 18th century, but we don't really know what was happening and causing him to do the things he did. And an deeper understanding of history and of musicology and anthropology and sociology is what we all need in order to understand not only what happened before, but what's happening now. And I think that's allowed me personally to understand my students better, because when I can see when they say what they like, what they really are trying to say. And I can identify what people really mean. You know, in church music, it has been a dichotomy for 60 years between the idea of traditional and contemporary, right? Have you heard this in churchgoers? It's like, well, hold on, I like traditional music. And I'll tell them, well, this song was written in 1972. And if 50 years doesn't give something traditional value in church, then what does? I mean, you know, or one of my favorite stories was the second or third week I worked at this Lutheran church I work at right now. I picked a hymn for the service that was a Martin Luther original, like straight up Martin Luther in the hymnal. And someone came up to me after the service and he says, that song was too contemporary. It's like, that hymn is 420 years old. What in the world are you talking about? You know, so it's not an issue of tradition and contemporary. It's an issue of familiarity, right? And it is a product of the fact that, like I said earlier, there's billions of people living, and you can't possibly hear all their music, and you can't possibly understand it all. And so we stick with what's familiar because we can be strong in what is familiar. But what happens is people hear a Martin Luther original, instead of looking down to see who wrote it, they just think that the crazy new music director picked a new piece that no one knows. I'm like, well, you should know Martin Luther. We are Lutherans. I mean, come on, let's you know. So there's a myriad of challenges when we strive to understand how people are expressing themselves and why, and in what aesthetic, values and what genre and what medium. I mean, but it all is interrelated. And the more we see that it's interrelated, the stronger we get at it faster, because you don't have to be a musicologist to truly understand what's happening if you understand what's happening in paintings. So if you totally don't understand what I'm saying, but you know about art, then use that strength to figure it out. If you're a psychologist, then by golly, I mean, you can figure out Wagner and why the man was the way he was really quickly if you just read one of his little manifestos he wrote. He wrote many of them. So use your strengths and your what am I trying? There's a word. Your interdisciplinary skills to ascertain and determine and divine, or whatever you need to do, what people are actually doing. You said something about politics, and then you said something about Tom. That was your second question, which was long.
I have something else that's related to it. I want to ask you right now that you're probably, maybe you'll come back to it. Wagner,
Go, Tom.
what you said about Wagner, and I had never heard this story about the opera with the brother and sister getting together and so forth. What about if that were changed and let it be just a regular marriage of a couple, where one of the couples happens to be Christian and the other one happens to be Jewish?
Well, that is, this opera has.
Speaking about the fact that Wagner, the time that Wagner was active in doing these things, and what the government did with his music later.
Right. So the trick is that when Siegmund and Sieglinde fell in love, they didn't know they were brother and sister. They fell in love before they knew, and the whole thing that happens at the end of Act 1 of Die Walküre is they have this realization. They're like, he's telling her where he came from and these things that happened earlier in his life, and she's realizing that he is her twin. And she says so, and he's like, who cares? And so there's this like, that doesn't really translate into a religious conflict. However, I have seen a staging of that opera where that exact thing happens, where it's like this Jewish prisoner falls in love with a Nazi. And that was actually in a German theater. But again, another thing to realize about German theater, there's this issue of Regia Theatre, which is the director's theater. All theater is completely nuts in Germany. If you don't believe me, go watch a German staging of these operas where, Tosca has tentacles and, people are walking around with cone heads and things like that, where they're just being crazy. But Wagner's music, again, Wagner was a horrific racist. He was, and he was absolutely anti-Semitic. I mean, he wrote a treatise called The Jewish Problem in Music, and it was widely published. I mean, he was a really horrible person. If you can imagine that his music was perverted beyond that point in its use in propaganda by the Nazis, it absolutely was. And so it was that rampant nationalism is a dangerous thing. And it's one reason why music got very much away from that quickly after the war, because no one wanted to. Everyone was sick of that. I don't think anyone was like, I don't want that to happen again. They were just like, I am sick of this. Let's get away from this, and let's be expression. Let's have expression be a different thing. And in fact, there's a whole movement in art and music called expressionism that is very much beginning of the 20th century. Very much worth a Google. Expressionism. Particularly German expressionism. Very, very interesting.
Joshua, you got a couple of minutes to go into more contemporary composer, John Adams.
So John Adams is a minimalist, and I think he likes the term minimalist. Philip Glass doesn't like the term minimalist. He prefers music with repetitive structures as a label for his music. And then you have Steve Reich, who's also that New York school of minimalism that developed in the 60s, early 70s. John Adams, particularly known for his operas, but also for his orchestral music. What exactly do you want to know about John Adams? John Adams is a great example of composer using political issues in music, though. In fact, recently, one of his operas called The Death of Klinghoffer was at the Metropolitan Opera and was supposed to be what they Met HD broadcast one month. And there was this big issue with the opera because I don't know if you know the story of Klinghoffer, but basically these terrorists take over a cruise ship, and Klinghoffer is this guy who was disabled and was in a wheelchair, and they pushed him off.
They dumped them.
They dumped him off the ship into the water. There's this scene in the opera where he is sinking in the water and the chorus is singing, and there were issues on one front with some of the words that were chosen because in the Islamic faith, if you invoke the name of Muhammad and things like that, certain things trigger, and they don't want to see that in art or theater and movies and all that. And then there was also some material in the opera that was critical of Israel. So there were these political issues brought to the fore very quickly of the subject matter of the opera, even though I don't think there was anything anti-Semitic about the content of the opera. I've seen the opera, but I'm not an expert on the opera. But the strong presence of political realities in this music. Philip Glass, as another minimalist, he left the United States after he studied at Juilliard and studied with Nadia Boulanger in Paris. While he was in Paris, Ravi Shankar was recording music in Paris, and he was tasked with listening to the music and writing it down. And he ran into problems because when you're notating music, you frequently have bar lines, right? In the last class, we talked about measures, and how you divide things into meters. Well, Indian classical music, which is a very racist term automatically. The reason why people call it Indian classical music is because it's complicated, very much like Western classical music is. And there's this assumption by Westerners for a long time that world music, cultural music is simple. So the fact that the Indian music is complicated, they call it classical music in order to give it this Western thing. Anyway, he ran into problems with that. And so a lot of these repetitive structures you see in Philip Glass's music are derived out of the Indian idea of the raga. And the raga is certain musical themes and rhythmic themes that contain extraneous meaning, which means that all of their instrumental music is very automatically programmatic, right? Because if you're bringing extra musical themes into music, it means that you're writing program music, which in Indian traditional music, they frequently are. When Philip Glass brought all this back to America, that sort of, and the Beatles, when the Beatles brought Indian music into America, you saw this strong adoption of that kind of thing. And Steve Reich is the guy that's really different from John Adams and Philip Glass, in that he was using a lot of technological things, like using tape loops. And the reason why Pink Floyd has that tape loop at the beginning of the song Money is because of Steve Reich. That repetitive tape loop at the beginning of the song Money. Does anyone know Pink Floyd? You've got to be kidding me, y'all. You're going to listen to some Pink Floyd.
Before my time.
Before your time, you're crazy, Paul. Philip, Pink Floyd is an interesting specimen of pop music that's taking on a lot of the same things that art music was doing at the same time, sequenced rhythms and repetitive structures. And there's so much to know, y'all. There's so much to know. Goodbye, Paul.
I've got to ring off, but what about next week?
Next week we begin the new class. So if you've signed up for a class in August, make sure that you have, and if you have, you'll get an email from me about that. This is it, y'all. This is choral music through the generation. I'm telling you, we screamed through it. We barely got anything out of it. There's more to know.
Now we know everything. Right?
Now you realize how little you do know. That's what I always realize every time I do this. It's like, wow, I missed that about so and so and so and that in this time period. And I realize how little I know, which excites me because, I was telling Hannah the other day, she said something about, I've never heard that opera, or I've never seen that opera. And I was like, I wish I could go back to the day before I'd seen that opera and see it for the first time again. You know, it's be wonderful. But every time you open a book of music history, it's like it's the first time.